Hello, welcome to our Week 7 lecture. This is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and this week's lecture will be about leaving St. Louis behind. And since we are in Week 7, we are beginning to wrap up our class, and we will be leaving our study of St. Louis behind soon ourselves. And so this week we will begin bidding farewell to a city, its baggage, and its history. Looking back to the past, we began this term with Father Jacques Marquette and his voyage on the great, wild Mississippi River. It was a muddy river surrounded by wild nature and people who lived on and through the land. And Marquette took us on a ride in a canoe, stopping to smoke the calumet, look at the piasaw bird, and to contemplate how to bring Catholicism to a region that still to this day both reveres and resists organized religion. And then we studied Lewis and Clark. Were they the beginning of a new country or the end of a civilization that was being pushed aside? The once thriving civilization of the Cahokians was long gone when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were commissioned to explore the Louisiana Purchase. However, there were other people living here who were pushed aside. Lewis and Clark spent 2 years exploring, learning about the plants, animals, and people who lived in the region, which was recently purchased from France. Lewis unfortunately died not long after the expedition, but Clark stayed in St. Louis, eventually becoming governor of Missouri. As St. Louis grew along with the rest of the United States and became the gateway to the West, everyone who came through here or lived here witnessed the injustices of slavery and the displacement of the Native American population. William Wells Brown wrote that, quote, "No part of our slaveholding country is more noted for the barbarity of its inhabitants than St. Louis," unquote. Charles Dickens noted in his writing about his 1842 visit to the U.S. that he met a Choctaw chief and there were but 20,000 of the Choctaws left, and their number was decreasing every day. And then we came to the eve of the Civil War, and the Civil War began. William Tecumseh Sherman helped win the Civil War for the Union at great sacrifice and cost, and we read about how he resisted going back into the military so that he could spend time with his family, but found that resistance to be untenable. And Sherman is considered a hero by many and a villain by others because of his march to the sea, in which he burnt down a lot of farmland and homes, and a lot of people in the South are not very pleased with his legacy. Logan Uriah Rivas tried to promote St. Louis to be the capital of our nation, but failed. If you can just imagine that St. Louis were the capital of the United States and how things might be different. And then we studied the tragic East St. Louis riot. The unbelievable cruelty and sheer evil of a night of violence were reported by Carlos Hurd of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and we discussed the importance of being able to have journalists talk about and write about what has happened and give people an account of what happened so that we can be informed. And then W.E.B. Du Bois investigated what happened during the riot and its aftermath, trying to gain some understanding of what happened there of work and wealth. Looking for a future now. So new authors, new era, we're going to kind of start over as we end our class. T.S. Eliot, considered one of the most important poets in the English language, or Thomas Stearns Eliot, was born in St. Louis, and his family founded both Mary Institute and Washington University. However, T.S. Eliot went on to study at Harvard and then lived the rest of his life in England. His work is densely populated by ideas, imagination, big words, and allusions to writers of all eras. He was very well read, and he is considered, as I said, one of the greatest English language poets ever. And here is his description of the Mississippi River. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. Eliot's most revered work is The Waste Land, a poem that begins with one of the most famous lines in literature. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. This line is in itself an allusion to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Maya Angelou was born Marguerite Annie Johnson here in St. Louis, but she spent much of her life elsewhere. She wrote many poems and books, including her autobiography, which we have an excerpt of this week, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, in which she described her family, including her mean uncles and her mother. Quote, "While we sat on the stiff wooden booths, Mother would dance alone in front of us to music from the Seeberg. I loved her most at those times. She was like a pretty kite that floated just above my head." And then Tennessee Williams, one of the most important playwrights of his era, was born in Columbus, Mississippi, but he lived in St. Louis for a very important part of his life. And his real name was Thomas Lanier Williams, but he loved his nickname Tennessee Williams. And Williams's mother, sister, and he are all buried in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis against his will. And Tennessee Williams went to University City High School, University of Missouri-Columbia, and then Washington University for a time. He worked at International Shoe when he lived in St. Louis. So he worked in a shoe factory making shoes, and then later became one of our most important playwrights. He wrote many plays as well as some early poetry. Each spring, there is the St. Louis Tennessee Williams Festival, which produces at least one of his plays and honors him in other ways. So I hope we all have a great week, and I'm looking forward to working with you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.